Well, this talk about, as Sergej mentioned, is about some aspects about how degree phrases are structured, and then somewhat unrelated about sort of a new observation that might be leading to an interesting generalization, but most likely the main part, the bulk of the presentation will be on the structure of degree phrases. So, just as a background, there's a whole different world from the world of like simple assertions. That is the world of assertions that include some gradable property. And one prominent family in that kind of family tree are comparatives, which again have like, numbers of different leaves. So it's standard to assume that in comparatives, like in 1, this book is longer than that book is, we have a gap that is removed by comparative deletion, like in 1b. And that allows you, on assumption of some details and parts that will be spelled out a little bit later, to get to the right interpretation, roughly like in 1c. So the set of degrees such that book is d long is sort of a subset, a proper subset of the set of degrees that this book is d long. There are a number of different types of comparatives, and that's part of the fascination. They come in different shapes and different flavors. So alongside with 2a, this book is longer than that book is, we have like attributive comparatives, like Mary read longer books than Bill read. Or we have like amount comparatives, which look very similar. Mary read more books than Bill read. And they also implicate some kind of like a deletion strategy outlined in 2 below. Now, apart from that kind of deletions that target the whole gradable property and its satellites, there is a process called comparative subdeletion, some example of which I give you in 3, in which only a small part, only the gradable adjective itself is removed. Something like, the table is longer than the door is wide. Sorry, yeah, what actually is removed here is something smaller even than the gradable property. Or in 3b, Mary read longer books than Bill did papers. So we see here a very small constituent being silenced. And a particular type of that kind of construction is shown in 3d, more men than women smoke. So those are sometimes called amount subcomparatives, or more recently, multi-headed comparatives. And the main kind of interest that the main focus of this talk will be on on the two constructions that are marked by the hand, on attributive comparatives on the one hand, and on multi-headed comparatives on the other hand. Now, as already mentioned, and it's clear from the meaning, in comparatives, we have a degree head. We have something that actually is introducing a degree. And there's some other part that is relating to degrees. In English, that would be more or less or as or to. So for instance, if we look at something like in 4a, this book is long or more interesting than that book is, we have a degree head here that sometimes shows up and sometimes not, and it's relating the comparative complement and the main clause. Now, interesting enough, there has been sort of a development, a recent development over the last 10 years to look more into the fine-grained anatomy of the degree construction, concluding that it's possible to decompose the various parts that play a role in semantics and introduce them separately in syntax. Which parts do I have in mind? It's on the one hand the degree head, that is sort of clear, but also the argument itself, the D that shows up here in the meta language, that the degree argument has been argued to be introduced by a syntactic operation, or basically by some functional head, such that the meaning of the gradable adjective, long or interesting, is smaller than what we thought it would be. This is actually an idea that goes back some way to Bresnan, So sometimes there is reason to believe that we have degrees being added to a non-degree, non-gradable property. So if you take a nominal like water, you need to add much in order to obtain sort of degree being for so much water. What I would like to do in this talk is the following. I would like to look at the two types of comparatives that I marked before, the attributive ones and the multi-headed ones, from that perspective, from that decompositional perspective. The idea, I want to see what actually happens once we want to give an analysis of attributive comparatives in which the degree head is added by a functional head. What does it tell us about the internal organization of the construction and the way the meanings are composed? Good. So just give you an outline of the roadmap here. So first of all, we will have a very brief, like an introduction on what the standard view is, what the orthodoxy is about what gradable adjectives mean. And there are at least 3 different theories or takes on how the meaningful parts are combined in syntax. We will spell those out. And then we will introduce the decompositional analysis a little bit more in detail. And that will give us a number of results in that only one option survives of the 3 possible options to combine the meaningful parts. So in some sense, switching from the orthodox view of gradable adjectives to a sort of decompositional view, I think necessitates narrowing down the syntactic options that are available to parse those strings that are compositionally interpretable. In sort of a second part, I will, if we have time enough at least, talk about some basic properties of multi-headed comparatives. And we'll see that there is an interesting restriction, and this restriction is something which actually I would like to get your feedback on that kind of like set of data, because it's not really clear, what its empirical scope is even. Okay, but let's start here. Good. On an orthodox view, which is more or less the standard, I would say, the meanings of gradable constructions always include measure functions. Measure functions are functions that map individuals to a certain degree on a particular scale. For instance, the measure function length could be seen as a function that maps individuals to the maximal degree of their length. Usually, these measure functions are thought to be part of the lexical entry of gradable adjectives. So, for instance, if you look at an adjective like long in English, then that adjective includes the measure function, and it imposes a restriction on the degrees that are in that domain. More precisely, on that particular kind of view of construing the degree adjectives, the gradable property is a relation between degrees and individuals, such that the degrees basically measure out from 0, that they measure from 0 up to the maximal length of a particular individual that is part of that denotation. Good. In the view that I just spelled out, where measure functions are part of the lexical specification, you have 3 different ways of combining the adjective with the other 2 relevant parts of the comparative construction. Comparative construction, as we said before, contains a gradable property and a relation and some kind of like standard of comparison, it's sometimes called, which is usually a then clause, for instance, in English. So schematically, what we have, and first option that we have looks as follows. So on that view, the adjective is the major projection, and it embeds a degree phrase, and the degree phrase is the host for the relation the more, for instance, or the less, on the one hand, and the degree complement. I will give you the details in a second. So to make like a structure like that work in semantics, there have been like various options around for a while. Maybe the most prominent one historically seen is the one given by von Stechhoff. And the idea is here that the more it picks up a degree and then combines with a gradable adjective denotation and then gives you an adjective denotation. There's also like one in which the measure functions are introduced in a different way. We'll come back to that in a second in 10b. One option that is has become prominent over the last 20 years is one which tries to make comparatives look more similar to other kind of quantifiers. On that view, that's usually called the degree quantifier hypothesis. Degree relation like more is construed as a relation between two sets, and it's sort of requiring that one of them is a subset of the other, and that makes them look for all means and purposes identical to every. Now, this is like just the set theoretic version. I give you sort of the version I'll be using here with the iota operator. This is just a question of expositional convenience I opted for here. Now, let's see what this kind of degree quantifier interpretation of more gives for the structure that we had outlined before. On that view, more is a two-place relation that actually applies to the then phrase first, which is a set of degrees. And what you get then is a generalized quantifier of degrees. So that's a second order property. And that generalized quantifier of degrees sits now next to an adjective. This was like the basic hallmark of the structure option 1. The AP contains the DACB, and by necessity now the DACB is like sister to the adjective. Now this creates a type conflict, evidently. And that type conflict, and this is like either the beauty or the the drawback of that kind of method, is this type conflict can be resolved by covert or some type of movement. I spelled it out in 13. So let's see what this looks like here, a little bit more detail. This book is longer than that book is. So we start out with the degree phrase next to the adjective in accordance with option A. Now, QRing the degree phrase and leaving a trace of appropriate type allows now the trace to combine. We predicate abstract over the degree phrase, over the degree at this higher level, and now the degree phrase can freely combine with its sister node. So the beauty of this is that it scope ambiguities between the degree phrase or some parts that are embedded in there and can interact with the rest of the clause, with parts that are in the rest of the clause. And that's exactly what has been shown in cases like 15. There's sort of a systematic interaction between certain type of quantifiers and the certain type of like comparatives. Why only certain type of quantifiers and certain kind of like clauses? Well, that's a question that has to do with the entailment patterns. In order to be able to test that actually there has been movement, you want to make sure that actually the readings that you create are stronger, so you can really test for their availability. Now, a classic example here is 15 in a context where the draft is 10 pages long. The paper is required to be exactly 5 pages longer than that. Can have 2 different readings. It has a so-called maximum reading and a so-called minimum reading. So on the maximum reading, we require that for every word that is accessible in our deontic alternatives, in every word that actually the requirements have to be fulfilled, the length of the paper is exactly like 5 5 pages plus 10, 15 pages. So the paper needs to be exactly 15 pages in all those alternatives. In this reading, require scopes over the comparative relation. If you reverse the order, if you let the comparative relation scope over require, we get something that can be paraphrased roughly like in 15b. So what we do here now, we actually looking for the single degree such that in all words, that degree is the degree of length of the paper. So that will be the minimal degree across all words. So that will be yielding a reading approximately like the paper has to be at least 15 pages long. Now that's sort of a classical kind of strong piece of evidence in support of covert movement. And yeah, there are various other kind of contexts that do that. So the option A says the adjective phrase contains the degree phrase. The lexical part contains the functional part. And if we combine that, if we marry that with the generalized quantifier analysis of more, what we get is sort of like a number of like interesting observations. One of them has been spelled out here. A second option, as far as the structure goes, looks as follows. Here we reverse the order. Here we assume that the functional category is containing the lexical category, and this option, this particular option B, assumes that the degree phrase has an adjunction side to which we attach the then phrase. So this is an option that we will return to in a second. And the reason why we just don't want to go into the details right now is it's very similar to option C, a third option. Here again, the degree phrase is containing the adjective phrase, but the organization between the degree head and the AP is different here. While on option B, the degree head and the adjective phrase form a unit, this is not the case in option C. In option C, it's the degree head and the then phrase, the then complement that form a constituent. Good. Let's see what that would mean. For option C assumes that, let's stick again with the assumptions of the generalized quantifier analysis of degree heads. So we have more combining with the then phrase. This is possible, and we end up here with the generalized quantifiers of degrees that cannot combine with the adjective denotation, so QR will rescue the derivation. Oops, I'm sorry. Now, as an I wanted to see actually all of these things. This is similar to what we have seen in option A, where the AP is embedding the DAC-B. We could rescue that situation also by QR. Option B, the one that we sort of like skipped in the discussion of its detail, is interestingly quite different in the sense that if we construe more and the AP as a constituent, we end up with a type mismatch again. But in this particular case, the type mismatch is lethal. So there's a lower type mismatch. There's a type mismatch also between, there's no type mismatch between the degree phrase and the then phrase, but there's a type mismatch at the lower level, and that type mismatch is lethal. So this is the first indication that, well, option A and C are better suited to actually provide the parses for comparatives on the assumption of the generalized quantifier analysis of degree heads. What I will be doing now is we'll sort of expand a little bit the picture and change the basic assumptions of the lexical account. Recall, we said in the beginning, it's possible to think of the degree argument that is part of degree constructions to be not part of the lexical specification of the adjective, but to be being introduced by a functional head. How would that work? On these so-called decompositional theories, we treat the degree argument in some sense just like the external argument in the individual domain in sentences. So Kratzer style in some sense. In order to do that, we need to do some changes, or people had to do some changes. In particular, Whalewood has a very nicely worked out proposal there. And the basic changes that need to be done have to do with the semantics of adjectives and nouns. So they're no longer just sets or properties of individuals, but they need to be something different that is compatible with adjectives. I'm not going to go into the details why this is necessary, but and it will not be of relevance for the further discussion. The idea is that long, an adjective like long, is now bleached in its interpretation. It's a set of states. It's a set of states that are long states. And similar things can be said about like individuals, like table. Table would be the set of table states, whatever. No? And the idea is that one sort of formulates a function that allows you to actually feed into that function this set of being long. And the output of the function will contain a degree argument that can be further manipulated in the semantics and syntax. Now, there are a couple of, or like at least two precise, to be precise, there are at least two proposals in the literature. I'm not going to go through the details here. I'm going to propose something which is given in 28. It's sort of a condensed version or something, a variant of what has already been done. What I call it the mu head. The mu head is a head that introduces, on the one hand, the degree argument. So it's like little v. And on the other hand, it's specifying the relation that the individual argument has with the state that is described by the basic denotation of the adjective. So, yeah, the idea is here that we sort of like feed long here, and then we get sort of a relation. We specify that whatever is the subject of long will be the holder of a state. It will be holder of a state, and that state has, if applied to the, if it's input into a measure function, the state yields a particular degree, and that degree needs to satisfy certain requirements. It must be like, you know, the up to a certain degree specified. Good. Let's see how that works in action. In 30, I give you sort of the basic the basic outline here. Again, for this table is longer than that table is long. I'm concentrating here on the, yeah, sorry, I'm sorry. Okay, so the idea is that there is a mu head, and the mu head is applying to the AP. The AP itself is only a predicate. It's a predicate of states. Now, once the mu head combines with the AP, you get your run-of-the-mill classical gradable adjective denotation, a relation between degrees and individuals. Now, the observation is that just as we have seen in other cases, in option C, when we want to combine that meaning with its sister node, we end up in a type mismatch. And that type mismatch can be resolved by QR. So what is different here That's maybe like the important part here. What is different from what I've been showing you before is just that part. Before we had sort of an AP here that was of type DET. Now we have like, you know, some substructure that tracks the decomposition. Good. This is markedly one difference between this particular kind of suggestion and other proposals that are out there, which make variable adjectives look differently type-wise than you know, standard theory has it. Good. So the basic meanings that you get from this are given here. So for this table is longer than that table is, you basically do the following thing. You say that the degree that actually is part of a conjunctive clause that needs to be satisfied by that table is below the degree that needs to be satisfied by disjunctive clauses of this table. And what are the disjunctions conjunction, I'm sorry. What are the conjunction, what are the requirements that this kind of like degrees have to satisfy? Well, there must be a state of length, and the table is the holder of that state, and the degree of that state is below D. So that gives you approximately the correct meanings of that construction. Okay. Now, let's look what this theory does once we go into a slightly more complex structure. If we go into attributive comparatives. Mary read a longer book than Bill. So again, we have a structure. I assume we start here with option C, in which the degree phrase embeds the AP, but the AP actually is introduced by a mu head. No? So the degree is added, and then we actually end up with the relation between degrees and individuals. Moreover, I assume here, and that is something which I take from previous work of mine and from Abney and other people, I assume here that in constructions with prenominal adjectives, in particular in comparatives, the AP and the NP, they form a unit, to the exclusion of the comparative parts. The other ways of doing this, and the other ways of doing that actually can be seen to be in troubles in various ways. Okay. So to repeat, the AP and the NP form a unit, and the degree head is introduced by mu. Now, one immediate advantage that this view has over standard views is that APs and NPs are of the same type on this kind of new version that Wellwood and others kind of develop, which allows us to actually combine them by predicate modification. So we don't need actually to combine an AP, would be of type DET, for instance, with an NP of type ET, and that's usually caused some headaches. So that's one simplification. So if we go to the decompositional view, we simplify the way in which we combine the attributive adjective and the noun phrase. So that's sort of one nice piece of evidence, I think, for decompositional analysis. Now let's go for, let's look at various kind of consequences of that particular setup. We call that under, we have three options of construing the relation between, the relation between the functional structure and the adjectives. On the option A here, the AP contains the degree phrase. On our option C here, it's the other way around. The degree phrase contains the AP. Okay. Given these two facts, we make two predictions about how these two factorizations, how these two phrase structures make attributive comparatives to behave. On the option A, the only way to actually combine the comparative, long or whatever, with the noun phrase, the NP, book, is to have the whole comparative longer than blah, 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 adjoined to book. On option C, the one that actually is spelled out here, things look differently, quite differently. Because here we have long, here we have book. So like long and longer book basically form a constituent, and the then phrase is sort of external to that. So on that kind of conception, we assume that the AP and the NP form a unit, and that leads us also to expect that pre-normal modifiers don't necessarily behave like adjuncts to a head noun. Let's see how this pans out once we expose these kind of like predictions to some data. Those are like old things from actually going back to my dissertation even. So I'm going through that quite quickly. One observation is that I have hidden from you so far is that the then phrase, Mary is taller than Bill, for instance, that the then phrase contains movement, a movement relation, anti-operator movement. On an adjunction analysis of attributive modifiers, we were led to predict that this relation here, the operator movement, is in violation of island conditions. Let's see how this specifically looks like. Take an example like Mary read a longer book than Bill did. So the then phrase contains an operator chain. In more precisely, the then phrase looks approximately like this here, like in 37. So Bill read a D-long book, and D-long is a joint to book. Now, if we want to create that operator chain, we need to extract out of a left branch an adjunct, and that is generally like disallowed, at least in like, Western Germanic languages, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Interestingly enough, this infringement of localities can immediately circumvent it once we assume that the adjective is not really an adjunct, but we have something like option C. That's option C here. Okay, what do we have here? We have long book. Again, Mary read a longer book than Bill. Above long book, we have the mu phrase. And then what we see is immediately that the degree, whatever degree actually is manipulated, whatever degree argument is manipulated, it's not going to be inside the AP. It's going to be higher up. And if one looks at the details, which I spare you here, that actually degree will be located in the complement position of the degree head. So if you assume that this is then Bill read, then you can create a licit operator chain by simply abstracting over that degree and combining then that degree with the mu phrase. So crucially, the assumption that we have option C available in which the degree phrase contains the AP, and the AP and NP form a unit that allows you to avoid locality effects that are not there. A second argument that speaks, we sort of trying to find arguments adjudicating between option A and option C. Option A is saying that the AP is higher, and option C is saying the CP, the DEC is higher. No? A second argument that actually helps us to decide between these two options is word order variation, non-attested word order variance. So in English, for instance, she read Dan Sally older books is not an option. The same thing holds for like a whole variety of degree constructions here. But this is exactly what you expect under the option A. Option A tells you, okay, you have the more, the degree head, and you combine it with the then phrase. And that is now basically embedded in the AP. And the AP together with this is an adjunct to NP. So in some sense, you have to get rid of the then XP, you have to get rid of the then phrase and like postpone it to a clause final position, for instance. How can you do that? Well, many people have surmised that's done by obligatory extraposition. Well, there would be a nice option, but or a viable option, definitely. It's not very likely to succeed, though, because all laws of locality tell us that out of these configurations, you cannot relate anything to an overt position to the right. So let's take another case of a non-comparative construction in 42. Mary met an older man yesterday than Sally met. That is okay. So that's a contrast between a comparative and a non-comparative construction. So Mary met an older man yesterday than Sally met. That's perfectly fine. So here, allegedly, the then phrase comes from the adjunct internal position. But lo and behold, if you want to relate an argument, something which arguably definitely came out of that adjunct position with postponed category, that leads very strongly deviant results. Mary met an angry man yesterday at Sally. And the same has been shown already, like for German in 43. So the option of getting word order right by extraposing the bold marked parts will not work, which means that you need to have a way of parsing the message in its surface position, and that is done by option C, like longer book than Mary. Those are, two arguments. I don't know how, we're doing time-wise here. Let me give one more argument for the assumption that the degree phrase contains the adjective phrase, not vice versa. If you look at something like 44, those are all classic examples from actually the 70s literatures, which have been reanalyzed in the 90s and afterwards. No? Mary met a man older than Sally. That means something like Mary met a man that was older than Sally was old, or is old. What can it not mean? What it cannot mean is Mary met a man older than the man that Sally met. So it can mean something where actually there's a small amount of ellipses in here, but it cannot mean something which has a lot of ellipses in there. Mary met a man older than Sally means Mary met a man older than Sally is old. And that's the only option here. Now, how do we actually treat post-nominal constructions? This is something which we haven't seen so far. So far, we have been dealing with attributive pre-nominal constructions. And how do they fare in the new theory? Well, here is sort of a first sketch here. Evidently, in this case, old and man should not form a constituent, or that's the most likely kind of like view here. So what we have here, we have old on its own, which combines with the mu hat that introduces the degree argument. And the post-nominal construction, oops, I'm missing the noun here in this configuration. I'm sorry. Yeah, here we see it more clearly. Here we see it more clearly. Whatever the relevant part, not relevant for the argument itself, is the same mechanisms that have been used so far, QR, allow us to actually interpret that kind of construction without any problems. So the relevant observation that actually underlies the imbalance of these two rings, the unavailability of reading 44b, is that the size of attachment of the then phrase determines the size of ellipses inside the then phrase. Let's see how this works, or how this actually manifests itself in the data. So we have just seen that Mary met a man older than Sally, only has a reading in which we, oops, I'm very sorry, only has a reading in which we do not require Sally to meet a man or to be a man. Interesting enough, in the prenomial construction, that is something which is inescapable. So if you compare 47, Mary met a man older than Sally, this doesn't entail that Sally is a man, and that follows from the small ellipsis analysis. What it says here is just that Sally is old. What happens in the prenomial construction, Mary met an older man than Sally, is first of all, we get an entailment that Sally is a man, making this sentence infelicitous. And second, we can take this as an indication that what is following Sally must be something bigger in ellipsis. It's not just old, but it's old man. So the structure is something like in B here. And the contrast between prenomial and postnomial constructions now, that is now something which boils down to the attachment side. In the prenomial construction, old and man form a unit. This was what we sort of saw in that kind of like configuration. So whenever you basically remove the gradable adjective, you also need to remove the noun phrase. I'm not going to go into the details here for time. Yeah, and having been too lazy to actually draw all these trees, to be honest. But in the postnomial construction, man and old do not form a unit. Older than Sally is a unit that is attached to man. So that gives you the option of having small ellipses, and that derives the contrast between pre and postnomial configurations. Good. So I'm going to skip over the next kind of observation. What we've seen here is a number of arguments to the following conclusion: that degree phrase embeds the AP, not vice versa. In attributive constructions, the AP and the NP form a unit. And that is like strong arguments against an adjunction analysis of prenomial modifiers. And it leads us with the structure that I have been calling option C as the best available one for parsing at least more complex structures like attributive comparatives, which means that the AP and the NP form a unit in the specifier of a degree head, and the more and the than phrase form a unit that that can be manipulated on their own. This is, by the way, I didn't want to rig this up in terms of like this particular kind of implementation of the decomposition analysis versus other ones, but this also bears on the issue of decomposition. So recall that there was one kind of like piece of evidence suggesting that having the degree argument being introduced by a separate head has advantages. Now, as I mentioned before, this goes back, like the idea of doing this is at least has two predecessors like Wellwood and Salt. And I didn't want to rig up now the following this story in terms of like, a new proposal versus what is going on in the literature. But if one looks into the details, partially also because of laziness, throwing trees, but if one looks at what actually Wellwood, the most worked out proposal, is doing, she is in the basic setup that she has chosen, I think, more or less married to the idea of having to choose option A. So like she's basically bound to actually accept the syntactic setup that is provided by option A. So this can also be seen, what we have been seeing here, as an argument against like competing accounts of decompositional analysis of comparatives. Okay, good. That's sort of the first part. I'm going to talk a little bit longer. Is this okay? Some 10 minutes or so. Excellent, thanks. About something quite different now, so-called multi-headed comparatives. Those are things like more men than women smoke, or in an object position, the project generated more problems than solutions. Now, the problem with this kind of construction is, what does more contribute? A way of actually making that work, the compositional semantics work, is, for instance, given by Grant, and she defines an entry, an additional entry for the family of more, as in 54. So more is a triadic relation. It picks up 3 predicates and it like compares their intersections. So that would give for 55 more men than women smoke something like the LF is more or less the surface structure here. Then more applies to women, to men, to smokers. And it's demanding that the women who smoke are superseded, the number of women who smoke is superseded by the number of men who smoke. Okay, that's approximately what we want. If the comparative is an object position, we find again a necessity to manipulate the string covertly, but this is nothing exciting, of course, at least given that we adopt the assumptions taken so far. Now, one question that immediately comes to mind, and this is actually what sort of like was one of the main motivations to actually work on this a little bit more, is whenever you find lexical ambiguity, in particular in the functional domain, it leads you to question, to actually investigate whether it's possible to actually redefine the ingredients in such a way that the ambiguity goes away. In some sense, that's a pretty simple setup here, of course. So the question is, can we in some way reduce 54 to the generalized quantifier analysis, to the classical generalized quantifier, generalized degree quantifier analysis of more? Now let's see what is happening. And the hope is, I mean, it's very simple to, let's see what is happening and what the consequences are. Good. Let's stick to the assumptions so far, that the degree argument is introduced by a separate head, and that we have QR to avail. Okay. Now let's also assume that it's like pretty innocuous, that in case we need it, we can existentially close off various parts. Now, more men than women smoke. Wait a second. Okay, looks now like this here. So let's start here with the combination of many men on smoke. So the idea is we have here the configuration, the LF configuration, once we have QR'd that portion. So more men than women would be the base structure, and we have QR'd, we have shifted to the left, evacuated the degree bar node. Okay. Now let's see whether actually we can combine those ingredients in a meaningful way. Here we combine the predicate modification. We get the set of all smokers that are many men, and then we need to find a place that actually is a propositional node, such that actually the degree phrase can QR to that propositional node. So let's assume that we close off that predicate. So the VP is of type T. Then we abstract over the degree quantifier. As usually, we get something like property of degrees, and the combination is straightforward. So it looks at first hand as if it's possible to use the regular degree quantifier, generalized degree quantifier, plug it into the construction, and derive the correct logical structure, logical syntax. Okay, let's see. This is what we get. This is what we get as sort of the rough meaning. So it's the degree, the degree such that the women smoke is smaller. Oh, sorry, the degree such that they're women to that degree is below the degree such that they are men to that degree and they smoke. Well, first of all, there's a sort of a problem that I'm not going to go into here. If one looks into the nitty-gritty parts of the mu, how the mu combines here with many women, then get DT. That is a problem that I'm ignoring here for the moment. But more clearly there's a problem about the formal link, as we might call it. This reading is too weak. It's comparing women, the number of women, to the number of men who smoke. But more men than women smoke means that the number of men who smoke exceeds the number of women who smoke. So there's something like too weak here. Okay. So the first try didn't really succeed. Let's see whether we can do better. And actually, to be honest, the reason I'm like subjecting you to this second is because I was so proud to actually have done the trees. And I find it like this Byzantine kind of derivation pretty interesting in itself. So yeah, let's just have a look at it. Okay. Now, second try is the following try. This is the following attempt. On the regular view, generalized degree quantifier is a dyadic quantifier. Okay. So it means that actually it takes two predicates. It's a second order predicate. It's a second order relation of two predicates. Okay. But we can also define generalized quantifiers of higher order. So what we do here in 60 is we simply make the generalized quantifier being a second order relation of triadic relations. Instead of dt, we relate det. That's also a type of generalized quantifier. And it might be well argued that in the degree domain, where you have like one more argument than in like non-degree adjectives like round, you have additional arguments. So you basically need to relate not, two-place relations, but three-place relations. Okay, so that is a possible kind of like generalized quantifier analysis of more, the more that shows up in these multi-headed comparatives, more men than women smoke. Now let's see, will that help us? Again, we find, let's start with the structure here. And let's start from the very beginning. Many men more than many women will be spelled out as more men than women. So I didn't really go into the morphology here, but the idea is that this functional head here triggers a spec head relationship with the head of the AP. And the head of the AP is many. So many will basically be spelled out as more. It's just like a side remark and a morphology. So the syntax looks like this here. We have now a higher order more that can combine with its sister node. Programmatically, we actually combine up to here, up to the deck B. but then we end up with the uncomfortable situation that we have like, a propositional node being sister to a predicate. Well, we know what to do. We QR the whole deck B, okay? So the first type mismatch is resolved by, like in 62, by QR of the deck B. The whole thing here goes to the left. We predicate abstract over an individual trace by assumption. And we end up in a situation like that here. We have now a predicate of individuals, and we have a truth functional node. Again, doesn't help. So why did we do that? Well, we were prepared. We were prepared, of course, because there's a second step. There's a second step that actually allows us to resolve that type mismatch. What does the second step do? It's actually taking the deck B, the more than women, out into a higher position. So that's the more or less the common kind of like movement that we have seen many times, where we take more than many women or whatever, the more plus the than phrase, we actually move it up here. And what we get now is the following. We leave here a trace, a degree trace that can combine with the adjective denotation. We have like here a predicate that can be combined with another predicate by predicate modification. We abstract over that, and we abstract over that degree argument, and we get something that can be combined with the landing site of the second step of QR. So this kind of like two-step version of moving, of QRing to avoid type mismatches allows us to get the logical syntax right. Okay, did we gain anything? That's the question now. It looks good. It's like, but if it's a car in which actually all the parts fit together, but it doesn't move, it doesn't make too much fun. Well, the type problem is the one that I didn't go into, but it's easy to see where it is. The type problem is solved now because of, the way that things are set up here. The second problem was the formal link problem. Well, the formal link problem, unfortunately, is not solved. It comes out more men than women smoke, comes out as in 64b. Here we compare the number of women to the men who smoke, and not the number of women who smoke to the number of men who smoke. So nothing, we gained nothing. And in addition, there are like more interesting questions about what all these movements predict for the interaction or for the interpretation. And I think also we get the wrong results here. So what we have to conclude, a generalized quantifier version of Moore is unlikely to succeed. What Grant was suggesting, the version in which we have a triadic quantifier, a triadic relation here, that seems to be the best option at the moment. So multi-headed comparatives are a nice challenge because we would like to fold them into the family of comparative constructions. And would like to actually not have to employ an additional degree head. Unfortunately, it seems at the moment, at least, that this is unavailable. So what we have seen so far is a positive result. We have sort of a particular kind of structure for degree phrases that actually is nicely, I think, compatible with a new set of ideas, the set of ideas that we sever off the degree argument from the denotation of the adjective. The second result is a negative result. We cannot take multi-headed comparatives and simply assimilate them to the other ones. And now in the last 2 minutes, if you allow me to, I would like to actually present something which I think is a general observation, but I'm not so sure about it. Okay. And if it is, it's actually an interesting one, I think. Okay. We all know the expletive, the tough construction, which has two variants, like in 71. It is tough to please enemies, or enemies are tough to please. Now, they approximately mean the same, not really, but more or less. Now, look what happens if we take a multi-headed comparative and embed it into, like in 72A, into a tough construction. In the expletive construction, everything is fine. It is difficult to read more books than articles. But more books than articles are difficult to read. That sounds pretty strange. Or more books are difficult to read than articles. Or it is 73, it is important to find more solutions than problems. That's impeccable. But more solutions than problems are important to find. That's gibberish in some sense. It's very hard to understand what that would mean. I would like to say here that the judgments are, of course, contrastive as usually, and some people actually get sent, like the B sentences are for some people, native speakers, grammatical, but they seem to reinterpret these tough predicates, the important or the difficult, in a different way, which is not intended. So the observation is, if we actually take tough predicates or predicates which fall in the same group, multi-headed comparatives cannot survive. Let's look at some other cases. For instance, take time construction or the make sense construction. They have been shown, for instance, in work by Gluckman, they have been shown to be very, very similar in their properties to tough constructions. So you can say things like, it took me a while to grow these plants, or these plants took me a while to grow. Now, let's embed a comparative. It took me a while to grow more plants than weeds. That's fine, huh? But more plants than weeds took me a while to grow. Very bad. Or it makes sense to grow these plants. These plants make sense to grow. Perfectly fine. It makes sense to grow more plants than weeds. Every gardener would agree, I think. But more plants than weeds make sense to grow. It's like really bad, no? Another question is, why is that? Actually, I've been testing this in some languages, in German and Greek, and this contrast seems to obtain there too. One question is it a more general kind of prohibition against combining the tough construction with comparatives? Is it that the binding relation of the degree argument in comparatives intervenes or like blocks or is blocked by the binding relations that you find in, for instance, the tough construction? Well, that's not likely to be the case, because you can see things like books are more difficult to read than articles. Here we have a tough construction and we have a comparative. The first problem was harder to solve than the second one. Totally fine. So it's not like, that kind of simple. Maybe it's because like in more men than women smoke, those indefinites, maybe that's like, these constructions, these multi-head constructions, they violate independent constraint on a tough construction. One of those many constraints on a tough construction is that it doesn't allow indefinite kind of subjects. Look at 90. A person was a delight to talk to, or anyone was a delight to talk to. Let's concentrate here on 90A. That's also a type of a tough construction. It was a delight to talk to anyone, but not anyone was a delight to talk to. But that would also not work in case of the comparatives, because many people are easy to talk to. That's totally fine. 91B. So what we see is an independent restriction on the tough construction, which says that you're not supposed to have stage level indefinites as subjects. That cannot be used to weed out the cases that we had in mind, like more problems than solutions are easy to find. Well, so we are at the moment here, and that's I would like to end with a generalization, which are called generalization T for tough. Multi-headed subcomparative cannot function as subjects of tough constructions. I give you a number of other roles, but we will not go through them because none of them lead anywhere. So the whole talk has been an exercise in showing you sometimes one hits gold, but in most cases, it's not so easy. So there's this kind of observation about the combination of tough constructions and comparatives, and I would be very happy to actually hear your judgments in your languages and also about your ideas. Let me very briefly wrap up here. We have seen that a decompositional analysis of gradable adjectives makes sense and can be embedded in a particular phrase structure, and that actually allows us to choose among a triad, 3 different options. We've also seen that is sort of reconfirming previous kind of ideas that I have been ventilating a while ago. And we've seen that multi-headed comparatives are showing a number of interesting properties that make them at least not easily amenable to a standard run-of-the-mill analysis in terms of degree quantifiers, and they possibly interact in interesting ways in the tough construction. Okay, thank you very much for your patience and for your time.
Thank you, Vinny. Thanks a lot. So now we have time for questions, discussion, and whatever comments we may want to make. I see one question from Dima. Dima, are you there?
Yeah, I have to actually, but yeah, just a short one. Can for examples like 74 to 76D, what if we strand the then group? If we say something like more plants took me a while to grow than weeds, does it make it more, less acceptable?
So we basically we postpone the than weeds. More plants took me a while to grow than weeds. That's a good question, because I think in the regular cases of tough construction, at least speakers didn't seem to make a difference. But here, I don't know. I have to. My native English is not so well pronounced. Thank you. That's definitely something to consider.
And the other bigger question is how are options A and C reconcilable with head movements like thingies we observe in synthetic comparatives, like under standard assumptions on what hand movement is, what lowering is, and what raising is, forms like longer and stuff like that can only be derived under option B, can easily be derived under option B, can with some juggling be derived under option A, but absolutely cannot be derived under option C because neither group is complement of the other.
Right.
How does head movements?
Can we go back? Okay, so we talk about the synthetic forms of longer. Okay.
Yeah.
And your observation was, can you please repeat, because I was for some reason I was still stuck at the multi-headed parts, and I was thinking you were referring to example A and C. Anyway, can you briefly run me through that again?
Under most standard morphological analysis, head movement requires one of the groups to be a complement of the other.
Yes, yes.
This holds in option B, obviously. This might hold in option A, depending on what else you think about the adjective phrase.
Right.
And this absolutely does not hold in options B.
What kind of head movement do you like posit there? So head movement,
either long to or to long. They have to get together somehow.
right? The question is like, whether one would like to derive the combination of longer from head moving long to ER, or one would like to do that in a different way. I mean, if one goes for head movement, you're absolutely correct. I mean, then actually the pie is cut in a different way. But the other ways actually of regulating inflectional morphology. And that way would be to treat inflection morphology of part of like, the outcome of agreement, of an agreement relation. So you have different exponents. You have long and longer and longest. And the choice of the exponent, the choice of the actual form, is dependent upon a functional head in a particular kind of configuration. So like in that option C, wait a second. For instance, on a traditional view, there would be like a spec head relationship. So the head here would specify what kind of like shape that head would take. So you're absolutely correct. If it's head movement that actually generates the overt forms, one gets different results. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, but okay. I mean, that doesn't really align with what we, okay.
Thank you, Dima. Are there any other questions? While people are thinking about their questions and complaints, may I ask you something as well?
Absolutely.
I have always found it a bit somewhat difficult to intuitively internalize the idea that states can have gradable properties like length or height or temperature. While it's not something that that you have invented, you make use of it. Well, when we, in a sense, when we talk about ordinary individuals, we know that they have, special dimensions. For example, they are manifested in space, and as such, they can be measured along different dimensions. But that's less obviously, I believe, extends to eventualities and, in particular, to states. What does it mean exactly that a certain state is long to some degree?
Yeah, that's actually a very, very interesting question. And I think it's like a hotly debated in philosophy of language too, and other areas as well. As you pointed out, so like, let me put this as a preamble here. I simply took that, I stole it, and I'm not responsible for any consequences.
Yeah, I completely acknowledge that. That's what I said. You're not.
The way actually it made sense to me is like, thinking back about this kind of the stage level, individual level distinction, the classical Carlson distinction. So where basically what that is like, you take an individual, like a table or wheel, no? And then actually you cut up, you have temporal slices of that individual, and those are the stages. And those stages can be different. And the dimensions put together, then you get the whole individual, no? And in some sense, I thought actually that could be, one could rationalize that.
Well, it may be, in fact, I think it may be a bit more complicated than that. There can be individual level properties not manifested in any of its stages, right?
In a stage.
Well, for example, I'm a nice person, but no stage of mine has ever been nice, right? That's a possible situation.
Yeah, of course.
But as an individual, I'm very nice.
Right, which I agree actually too. Huh? Right, but in some sense, I thought actually that there's some kind of like maybe deep homology between that kind of like stage individual level on the one hand, treatment of individuals, and a state treatment treatment of like sets of inequalities in terms of states now. And I think the most insightful and extremely interesting and stimulating work on that is by Roger Schwarzschild, who has been working on the system on that. And I really suggest, advise, or hope that you will be able to read that, because it's really, as usually when Roger Schwarzschild is presenting something new, it's always very, very exciting. Let's put it this way.
Well, in fact, he presented his work in which he treated, nouns and adjectives as states at this colloquium a couple of years ago.
Fantastic! So you're more familiar.
So we have invited him, and so we sort of learned about those ideas of him. And if I may, just one more observation. Have you looked at multi-headed adjectival modifiers like more smart than handsome?
That's an interesting question.
It crossed my mind that in some respects they may be parallel to what we observe in tough configurations with multi-headed comparatives you have just discussed. For example, I think it's not so good to say a more smart than handsome person, right?
That sounds bad.
But it improves if we say a person or the person more smart than handsome.
Yes. I mean, I think that's a head final filter in some sense. Like a proud of his dog man is bad because you need to have the head. In a pre-nominal modification structure, the head must not be interrupted from the nominal head.
Right.
That you get a more handsome man. Your second example was, I think, this is a man more handsome than smart.
For example, yes.
Yeah, here we don't violate this the head final filter, while in a more handsome than smart man.
Yeah, if that's a head final filter, then it's not extendable to the multi-headed comparatives you have discussed. Well, in an obvious way, possibly.
Right.
Okay.
But it's always interesting to fiddle around with these kind of like configurations. No?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, complaints, observations? Okay, so I would like to express our deeply felt gratitude to you, Vinny. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the exciting, thoughtful, informative presentation, and we would like to ask you to send us the handout that
Absolutely.
so that you can study afterwards.
Let me actually let me send you the handout, but I think the shortcut keys. Oh, Sergey, can I send you the handout and you distribute it? Is this easier?
Yes, absolutely. Yes,
because
thank you.
Okay, I would like to thank you all for your time, your attention, and your patience, and for the great comments. And I hope you're all well.
Thank you, Vinny. And may I add that we would be happy to have you here again with your talk on whatever topic you would feel to share.
Would be a great pleasure.
Sharing with us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.